extremely lucky for our second session this morning to have the person who's been frequently referred to already in the course of the debate, which is Professor Dame Elan Stevens. As we know, she became the interim chair of the BBC in somewhat difficult circumstances, and it certainly seems to us that she's managed to steer an extremely safe case through rather troubled waters over the last few months. But to do the full introduction, I will hand over to our moderator for this session, who is Helen Bowden. Helen Bowden, very well known to, I think, most people in this audience, was director of BBC News, director of radio, 34 years in broadcasting, absolutely distinguished broadcaster of our time. So Helen, and of course, a patron of the VLV. So over to you, Helen.
My pleasure. I'm not going to do lots of introductions because I actually want to go through her career a bit after we've heard her speech. But all I can say is I think we're all, as VLV members, really thrilled that you're here. And we all have great sympathy for the position you find yourself in. So do your speech and let us hear where you're up to and what's going on at the BBC.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Thank you. That's the best introduction I've ever had, so thanks. Great. It's a genuine pleasure to be here with the VLV. It's an organisation that I've held dear for many years. And I want to thank Colin for his invitation. But more than that, I want to thank Colin for taking on the mantle of the leadership of this organisation after the death of our very dearly beloved Jocelyn, whom I knew and respected, and I think one always cared about Jocelyn. She was such a dynamic person in quite a frail body, and one just felt the enormous respect for what she's done. And it's now 40 years, I think, this year, since this organisation was started, which is a remarkable achievement. So thank you also to the VLV and all you members in the room for the passion and the commitment you have for the BBC and for public service broadcasting in general. The BBC belongs to its listeners and viewers, and we're very grateful indeed for the work you do to support and to challenge, and in particular for the constructive contributions you make to the debate around the future of the BBC. I'll come to some of that shortly, and I'll pick up on some of the important themes that Lord Grade has left us with. But this week marks 5 long months since I took up my role as acting chair. So I remember one newspaper marked the moment with a headline that said, "New BBC chairman is a state-educated Welsh speaker." Well, that's quite a badge of honour. And I'm pleased to say, in Wales, it just went viral. Someone even started on Etsy, I think. They started selling a T-shirt saying, "State-educated Welsh speaker." So wherever my career takes me next, I'll be able to say, so don't groan, this is a bad joke, but I've got to say it. I've been there, I've done that, I've got the T-shirt. So this has certainly been a roller coaster period, and the BBC very, very much in the spotlight. But most people have only one baptism of fire. I think I can claim to have been baptised several times over. But it's also important to stress that the chair and the board aren't here just to respond or comment every time the BBC is in the headline. We are here to ensure that the BBC delivers on its mission and its public purposes, and to make sure it continues to provide value for the licence fee as we accelerate into the digital media age. But there is one principal responsibility that I just want to take hold of today and focus on, and that is the words of the Charter, to uphold and protect the independence of the BBC. This is no abstract responsibility. It's a task we engage with as a board, as chair, actively each and every day. So many of you, I know that you are steeped in the history of public service broadcasting and the BBC in particular. So I don't need to tell you, but I'm going to tell you, that it was in 1926, of course, during the general strike, that Winston Churchill, then Chancellor, urged Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to commandeer the BBC airwaves for the government. And this is a fledgling BBC. It's not the big organisation it has become today. So John Reith, the founding Director General, resisted. He argued it would destroy the BBC's reputation for independence and impartiality, and his argument won out. It was a moment that drew a clear dividing line between being the kind of state broadcaster that we see in other parts of the world and being a national broadcaster, in the service not of the government of the day of whatever colour, but of audiences. It's not an easy line to navigate, and governments of all stripes have found the concept difficult at times, but all have ultimately respected and maintained it. Either because they understood that the BBC's independence was a central feature of this important and highly successful role we play in British national life, or perhaps because they recognised that the public cherish it deeply and would defend it if pushed. That moment in 1926 was not only a historic crossroads in itself, but it paved the way for the BBC's transformation a few months later from a company to a public service corporation. Reith and others had understood the incredible power of broadcasting as a new communications tool, and they believed it needed to be harnessed in the public interest. So there were a few fundamental principles. Everyone should benefit, information should be trustworthy, programmes should not just amuse people, but also enrich their lives. And so we come to that Reithian mission to inform, educate and entertain. 90 years later, in 2016, the BBC's latest Royal Charter built on and broadened the wording of that mission. And I quote, "To act in the public interest, serving all audiences with impartial, high quality and distinctive media content and services that inform, educate and entertain." That's significant because it underlines the fact that over the 100-year history of the BBC, those fundamental values of independence, impartiality and universality have become more important, not less. In fact, the Charter in 2016 introduced a whole series of changes that were explicitly designed to further safeguard those core principles. So, for example, the current unitary board was established with no more than half of board members permitted to be government appointees. That introduced a much clearer division of responsibilities between the board and a strong, independent external regulator in Ofcom. There was a new process for setting the licence fee to give the BBC the certainty and stability of a 5-year settlement, and we're just at the midterm review now of that licence fee, to prevent any perception that questions around the funding of the BBC might therefore interfere with its operational independence. And there was new language which required the BBC to fully represent all the diverse communities of the UK. It might be easy to look at all this and think, they're boring. They're sort of just the words that go on in the background. But I've spent most of my career not just around broadcasting and the creative industries, but in governance of broadcasting and the creative industry. And I know really well that how we choose to govern the BBC as our national broadcaster takes us to the question of what we want it to be. It fundamentally defines what it is able to achieve, both for audiences and the UK as a whole. And if we want the BBC to reflect and defend British values, those values need to be embodied in our operating framework and upheld in our systems of governance every day. So this gets to the heart of the question that Lord Grey touched on this morning. What do we want the BBC to be? Does the UK want and need a national broadcaster of scale continuing to operate worldwide? So it's worth perhaps taking a step back to reflect on how unique the BBC is in the global landscape. And, you know, I'm so proud to be here as the acting chair when I think that this is the UK's best known cultural export, synonymous with great quality, carrying the UK's voice, cultural influence, democratic values to a global audience of around 450 million people each week. Not just the most trusted news in this country, but the most trusted international news broadcaster worldwide, with a world service that for 90 years has been a beacon of journalistic integrity and a lifeline for those living in fear and uncertainty or captivity. It's an extraordinary national institution and one of the country's finest achievements. But as with all great and long-lasting institutions, there's also a danger that we just take it for granted. There's a risk that we take for granted the reason it is able to achieve what it does for the UK, namely its independence. This is the principle that sits behind so much of our free and democratic society, and so many of the institutions that uphold it, from the police to the judiciary. All are free from government control, but they are answerable through them to the people. And all require really strong systems of governance, precisely because the independence needs safeguarding. Without those systems, without agreed standards and norms, independence can fray. Gradually, and then suddenly it's gone. That's why they require something else too. They need people to defend them and to believe in them. That just goes for the BBC, just as it goes for many other world-class UK institutions. So independence is not ultimately upheld by contracts, clauses, committees. All that's necessary. But above all, it needs the support of individuals. Individuals on the board, individuals in particular parties, in every part of the United Kingdom and in this room. So my view of what I would like the BBC to be in future is clear. And as I said when I took over, when my fellow board members put their trust in me 5 long months ago now, I wasn't a caretaker because the institution can't afford stasis for 5 months. It needs to move forward. So I want the UK to continue to benefit from a national broadcaster that offers something for everyone. Trusted news, high-quality British programmes, educational services for children. I want it to reflect every community and make sure all voices are heard. I want to support, as Michael said, the creative economy to grow in all parts of the UK and to continue to be, by far, the single biggest investor in homegrown content with a massive injection of UK-originated programming. And I wanted to be a broadcaster of scale, working to carry our collective voice, values and influence worldwide. And for me, all these roles and responsibilities have only become more important, not less so, in recent years. The extraordinary pace of change in the global digital age has seen the whole news landscape become much more partisan. We've seen some of that bubbling up in the previous session. It's become opinionated, and there's a rush for online engagement. It's seen a huge upswelling of disinformation, leaving people wondering who and what they can trust, and even questioning what's truth. It's seen media freedom under growing assault, and bad actors from seeking to manipulate our information landscape and disrupt our democratic processes for their own gain. And it has brought the powerful polarising effects of social media into our society with echo chambers that only harden our views. And all as we look ahead to a year that could be the most polarising yet, with elections for over half the world's population. That's quite an amazing year ahead. And it has brought the very real risk that homegrown UK stories and storytelling will lose out in a marketplace dominated by international tech giants. So the BBC is unique in its ability to respond on each of these fronts, underpinned by its independence and public service mission. But whatever your view of what the BBC should be in the future, as Michael has said, it is only once you've decided the scope of the BBC that you can consider how best it's funded. So clearly, the question of our future funding mechanism is never far from any debate around the BBC, and I'll come to that in a moment. But before we all panic, it is important to stress that the licence fee is guaranteed as a mechanism until at least the end of the current charter in 27. So any conversation is about what happens after that date. So it's worth making a few important points. First, as the VLV has done so much to highlight, the BBC experienced a real-term fall in income of around 30% over the decade from 2010. And it continues to operate in an environment of high inflation and further licence fee freezes and industry inflation careering ahead of actual inflation. These are challenges for Tim Davey and his management team, but they're not dissimilar to what others in the industry and beyond the industry are dealing with. So the challenge is to how to respond creatively and with audiences at the forefront of our mind. So being at the leading edge of efficiency, managing digital transformation, investing in the future. This has meant and will continue to mean difficult choices, implications for our services, and of course for our audiences. However, I believe that the challenge, the real challenge for me and for the board, is how to make sure that a leaner BBC can also be a better BBC. I think it can be, but it needs focus, innovation, determination to always put the audience first, not the need of the institution. And of course, to get that right, we will always need to have important conversations with the public, with politicians, with all stakeholders about what the BBC should look like as a world-class asset for the UK in the digital age. And secondly, despite these financial pressures, it is remarkable value. I would say that, wouldn't I? But let me just take you through. We talk about a TV licence. In fact, it's called a TV licence. But it does pay for everything. 8 national TV channels, 10 UK radio stations, 6 national stations, 39 local ones, all our digital apps, BBC News, Sport, Weather, iPlayer, Sounds, Bite Size, children's education services, orchestras, the proms, the World Service. So when the cost of the licence fee is compared with the monthly cost of a subscription streaming service, it'd probably be around 400 a year. And that's, a pretty accurate sort of comparison. And third, there's a point to be made about the principle that lies behind the licence fee. The idea that everyone pays, everyone gets something in return. It's a pretty basic premise of how we function as a society, how we foster social well-being and cohesion. We pay for things individually that all of us can benefit from in return, from healthcare to local services to education. But it's hard, very hard nowadays, to ignore the fact that we've moved away from that frame of thinking in recent years. We are now more in the mentality with the principle of, why should I pay for what I don't use? So we need to ensure that any conversation we have about value and the licence fee recognises that our relationship with the BBC is not simply about a transaction between the individual and the BBC, but about what we want our broader relationship within our society to be. So when it comes to the question of alternative funding models, the BBC has set out five principles which are at the heart of the debate, and I'm sure that you are well aware of them. Does it deliver the mission, universal public service? Does it safeguard impartiality and independence? Does it provide a sustainable financial model which can lead us to innovate and modernise to meet new audience demands? Does it help the creative economy to grow, enabling the BBC to invest and work in partnership to grow world-leading UK creative industry, British talent, export British content? And does it deliver fair value for audiences? These are the 5 questions we believe any funding model must be able to answer, and answer satisfactorily. So to conclude, I'm sure you'll love hearing that word, I haven't talked today about all the excitements of content, you know, the things that I revel in and I'm proud of and love to be around and about. Strictly, Doctor Who, I was in Cardiff last week celebrating the 60th birthday of Doctor Who. I was the commercial chair when we did the deal with, when the deal with Disney was just going through. Planet Earth 3. And I should mention that David Attenborough's latest is one of the highest rated programmes of the year in any genre, with over 10 million viewers. Of course I feel proud of the work the BBC is doing across its outposts, and that it's at the top of its game. But I'm particularly proud of the work that our news teams are doing to report from the ground in every part of the world, often in the toughest of circumstances and often with personal jeopardy. The role of the board is to make sure that the Director General and Executive team have the space to make the right decisions in the interest of audiences, and to do so independent of commercial or political pressures. My belief is that for 101 years, the UK has had something very special, very important. We invented public service broadcasting. We introduced it to the world, and we put independence at its heart because we wanted the whole of society to reap the rewards of its very considerable economic, social and cultural benefits. All of us recognise that the BBC has no inherent right to exist. The plethora of choice, the undoubted quality of our competitors in the digital age will always draw questions from some quarters about the BBC's ongoing relevance. But I believe we should see those questions not as a threat, but as a real opportunity. An opportunity to defend the very precious thing that we run the risk of not fully appreciating the value of until it is lost, until it's gone. And more than that, a chance to make the case for the BBC as being more important and necessary now than at any point in its history. It's a case which rests with our values, on the unique role they allow us to play for the UK at home and around the world, and how they can help us to harness the incredible power of technological change in the public interest, just as we did nearly 100 years ago. That's why, for me, the BBC's independence is sacrosanct. It's inseparable from the mission we deliver to audiences and the role we can play in UK national life. And it is therefore something for us, to respect, to protect, and to champion long into the future, and long when this acting chair has gone from her role. Thank you very much.
told you she was good. Thank you for that very heartfelt speech. I'm going to talk a bit about you because you've talked about the importance of the chairman for the integrity and independence of the BBC. And if we look at you, state-educated Welsh speaker doesn't really capture the breadth and depth of your career. I mean, you went to a Welsh state school, a comprehensive, I think. You got an open scholarship to Somerville College in Oxford. You're steeped in broadcasting, the creative industries and academia. You've served on the boards of the BBC Trust, S4C, the Welsh Permanent Secretary, the BBC, and a wealth of other bodies. You're really experienced in defending the independence of institutions. Many would say and have said you would be ideal as a full-time permanent chair of the BBC. So have you put your hat in the ring?
Oh, that's a difficult one, Helen.
That's a denial.
You know, you can tell she's been a journalist all her life. I think the Sunday Times put my name out last Sunday. There are several names, I think, in the frame, as there always is. And so, in the end, it is a number 10 choice. And
that's not answering the question, and it's not a denial.
It's not a denial.
So, in your this loose sense of are you on the list, who's put you on the list, how fair and genuinely independent has the process of selection been? You know, we were promised this after the Richard Sharp debacle. It's incredibly important that this process is seen as absolutely shot through with independence and integrity. The headhunter rang me, obviously not to become chair of the BBC, but to ask me for any ideas. They're like estate agents for people, as you know. And what they were struggling with was people did not feel it was anything other than a fix and so weren't going to put themselves forward. From your perspective, whatever it is, Elan, how fair has this process been?
Well, I'd like to pay tribute to Lucy Fraser in her role as Secretary of State, because I think that she's a KC, of course, and having read Heppenstall and seen the references to the previous process, including the lack of headhunters and perhaps an over-reliance on a name being out before the process had been finished or even closed, I think she has gone out of her way to make certain that there are headhunters, that there is a wide variety.
And they're very good headhunters as well, actually.
And that the process at each point has been conducted, the interview was chaired by the Permanent Secretary and 3 completely independent members and not by the political class.
And do you think she's been able to resist meddling? It's a very powerful role when you're Secretary of State.
That's a question you have to ask her, because I haven't seen it personally. But
It's come at an incredibly difficult time for the BBC, I think, this selection process, because in all my long years at the BBC, I've rarely seen such brutal criticism from senior politicians, including the Prime Minister, about BBC coverage. The coverage, the conflict between Hamas and Israel, and particularly the furore over the use of the word terrorist. Will that have an impact on who gets chosen, do you think? That very, in a broader scheme of things, very important, but actually quite narrow and specific issue of impartiality, in your judgment? Can
I just take a step back and answer that question? Of course there has been criticism and visceral criticism of the BBC. And one can understand, after the horror of the 7th of October and after the bombing of Gaza, you know, there are emotions which are incredibly high on both sides. And those members of the cabinet, members of parliament, they're human beings as we are, and they have their allegiances and their friendships and their families. And they will come to this with their own lenses. I mean, the point I was making today was, whatever that is thrown at you, whatever the criticism, you have to look at that criticism, examine it and think about whether it's fair or whether it is something that is actionable or whether it is something that is to be resisted and to maintain the independence of the body. So that's where I come from. To answer your question about whether that will have an impact on the choice, I would hope that the choice is about the merit of the person and the ability of that person to lead one of the best institutions in the UK. So there are, to bring to it a knowledge of the industry and a sense of governance.
But
And
you
I
yourself have said that impartiality and independence are core for this role.
Indeed.
So impartiality in this particular conflict are likely to have been involved in the conversations. Have you yourself in this acting role or the board come under any pressure from government ministers about the coverage? I mean, it's not unusual because it happened to me as Director of News.
You know yourself. Yeah. This is not an unusual occurrence for the BBC board or for
or the Director
BBC
of News.
Chair or the Director General or the Director of News. It's daily. And the ferocity of it, or the, shall I say, it's not just the ferocity, it's the fact that it's very public at the moment because we're all so glued to the story. And so we're more aware of it. But there is always a tension between views and the board. So, as I said, you know, impartiality, the independence of the body, the ability to, without fear or favour, to actually lead the organisation with integrity, so that it is trusted for the future.
So what's your style when you get that kind of attack?
I'm quite a calm person. My children wouldn't say so, but on the whole, I tend to reflect and to try to objectify what is being said. So rather than take it as a personal, emotional attack, I would like to take a step back, consider the evidence of what I've heard and consider the evidence on the other side and look at our guidelines and then come to a conclusion. I do not want to engage emotionally back. I think that is completely wrong for a chair to do.
And of course, it's also the essence of impartiality, it's a kind of chilly ethos, impartiality, which is why people often find it very, very difficult as a concept. Do you think politicians actually understand impartiality? That it's written into the charter, and it's fundamental to the BBC. But my experience was actually they're rather baffled by it.
Well, I wouldn't say they're baffled because they're clever people.
Not all of them.
Well, that's your view, Helen. And they, on the whole, they're a pretty astute lot. And I think a lot of people understand impartiality intellectually. It's just when it hits a little nerve in their particular personal life that it becomes very difficult.
Or you could argue that politicians are rather unusual because, unlike most of us, they actually think that what they believe is so important, they go and get our votes for it. And therefore they have a mindset that's incredibly different from the impartial mindset.
Yes, but also, in fairness to them, they have had our vote. So
no, absolutely.
Their voice is a voice of an elected representative, and therefore must be given due consideration.
I don't think where anyone was saying we don't listen to them. It's just the degree to which they have any openness to the degree of to what impartiality actually involves.
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult, isn't it, when we've got a political system that, to a considerable extent, makes you even the very objective ones become
Polarised.
tribal.
Yes, absolutely. No, I agree with you.
So
do you think the BBC could do more to educate politicians? I remember when Jeremy Hunt was Shadow Culture Secretary, and he came to see me and he'd read a book about how biased the Today programme was, written by a disaffected person who'd worked there. And I said, do you listen to it? And he said, no, I listen to Radio 2. And he said, and I said, why don't you... But I've read this book and I know all about your bias. And I said, well, why don't you come in and watch a programme go out from the very beginning and then stay till the end and listen to the wash-up? And bless him, he did. He came in at whatever time, 5:30, 6 o'clock, stayed through, and it genuinely made a difference to him. It's not that he agreed with all the choices, and I give him massive credit for putting the time into that, but he actually saw the care people took about those things. Do you think we've gone past that being possible in our current political climate?
I would like to see some politicians, and not just politicians, coming in to see our verify unit, for example. I think that the care and detail that goes into verification is something that is of profound significance to trust. For example, I visited the other day, there was one specialist on pixels, whether the pixelation meant that the picture had been manipulated electronically. There was a person who was looking at shadows falling or light falling.
Whether it's at the right time.
At the right time, whether the sun is, in the right place, to verify that as being the date and time that it is supposed to have happened. So all this is enormously detailed and forensic. And I would like people to understand also the two sources, the kind of real care that goes. I think... was it Michael Great who said to Katie Russell, that she knew what she had to go through mentally in order to make a statement. People don't make statements off their own bat. It comes through all the editorial guidelines. So, yes, I would like people to appreciate that. On the other hand, I also recognise that people have lives of their own to lead and busy lives at that. And the higher up the politician, I sometimes think, in this present role, for example, how difficult it has been to have kind of the thinking time, the space between meetings to actually think things through properly. And I just think of the pressure we put our politicians under in the number of meetings, the number of public facing events.
In fact, we swap them round every 6 minutes, so they never get an expertise. I don't think that necessarily helps either. You've brilliantly quoted John Reith. I am a massive fan of John Reith. Around the time that he was arguing for public funding for his radio startup, the British Broadcasting Company was then, he said public money was essential to save his company from force and money. Unfortunately, the two unfailing powers. And my goodness, that's still true. And he, of course, was talking about force in a literal sense, because he was talking about the propaganda of the First World War, and he was talking about political force. Yeah. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the BBC board at the moment, as it were, imposed by government? I mean, you've got massive changing audience landscape, technology changes, but that core thing, the relationship that the chair navigates with government.
I wouldn't put that as... I'd put the independence at the core.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put the relationship with government as my top thing. I mean, for me, it's managing change, because the organisations are 100 years old. The reason it has survived so far it's because it's always changed. It's not because it's fossilised and maintained everything as it was. So let's take that small radio company.
Extraordinary.
It grew within, I think, about 10 years. The growth was phenomenal. People had a thirst for this product. So if you change that into many radio channels, then that transition from radio into television, a transition, much as we admire Reith, that he resisted.
Of course.
And said, who's going to look at that little box in the corner when they have radio?
He wasn't infallible.
So you change there, then that you have a monopoly, then a duopoly, then you smash that with the emergence of Channel 4, and then all the other digital channels that emerged during digitisation, and then that massive translation again into iPlayer, which enables you to have a library moment, to go to your shelf, pick out something and browse through it, which is a completely different concept from the linear broadcasting. And the BBC has risen to that challenge all the time. I kind of think about it almost like a snake throwing off its old skin, and emerging, recreated each time. And so the big question for us now is, how do we use this power of technology, this digital age, to reach out to people who may not be using us all the time or frequently, or who may even think that they don't need us, and to have some sort of technology that is not volume-driven, but value-driven. So if you're Amazon and you're selling thousands of something, you know, that's probably your most popular product. The BBC, whatever technology it will use in future, it cannot be volume-driven.
So you're talking about intense personalisation.
I'm talking about intense personalisation and the need for us to embrace change, and all of us to embrace change, because change is frightening, and it's deeply felt. It's felt by employees and staff as something to be frightened of, because we all.
Most of us resisted.
We're happier
Yeah.
with ourselves as we are.
So one of the great changes has been the creation of BBC Studios, which gets more and more what was public service content piled into it. It's clearly a commercial operation. I totally understand when you've lost 30% of your real income over 10 years that you need to find other ways of generating income. But I just wonder how effectively you've explained to the broad mass of the licence fee payer that effectively their licence fee is a kind of seed funding for a commercial operation. I mean, most of us think, well, you can intervene, but most of us think our licence fee, this is actually not quite true, because if you look at all the commercial UK services the BBC provides, the different channels it provides with curated content, it's never been a simple public service versus commercial. But I do think that most of us do think our licence fee goes towards non-profit making public service. And I just wondered the degree to which you've bothered to have a conversation about the world is changing and you need to use the money differently.
No, not at all. Not a penny of that licence fee payer money is in order to prop up a commercial operation.
But BBC Studios is a commercial operation,
Indeed,
surely.
Indeed. It's a wholly owned subsidiary. And by being a wholly owned subsidiary, all its profits reverts back to the public service.
That's great.
There is no two-way operation. In fact, there is an absolute Chinese wall between the public service licence fee and the commercial
Yes, but they
operation.
have to operate in a commercial environment. Therefore, they have to think about the market more than anything else. Therefore, let me finish the point that the way you commission for a commercial model is somewhat different than from a pure public
Indeed.
service model.
So who commissions? This is absolutely the question. The commissioner is the public service commissioner. It is Charlotte Moore's head of content. So when she is thinking about her BBC One, she is thinking, I do want David Attenborough. David Attenborough is a very expensive product for very, very good reasons. We would all wish it to be an expensive product because it goes to places that no man or woman has been before. So in order to make that, you have to sell it all over the world and you have to have partners. And so the commercial operation comes into being to assist, but it is not a standalone commercial operation in order to make money for itself. It always makes its money for its whole, as a wholly owned subsidiary. All the money goes back.
No, I understand that, and that's clearly a very canny way of trying to supplement the licence fee.
Well, it's not canny. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it?
Canny is a compliment.
Good word.
But I'm interested in, so how does it work? So the FT today has got a good story about your relaunching of your news service in America, bbc.com, which is a commercial news service, which we know in abroad is absolutely fine, still owned. Who actually funds the startup of that?
And that's the commercial.
So that would be BBC Studios going into that. So that's not going into licence fee viewed. It's not going to a UK service, is it? Or have I misunderstood?
No, I mean, there are, as the previous chair of the commercial...
Well, you know
I do know a little bit about this stuff. So there are things which are, as an Attenborough would be, co-produced, as indeed the new Doctor Who would be, in order to have a bigger budget for the...
Yes,
for
and we've
BBC
always
One.
done that. The BBC has
But there
done that
are
forever.
also things which are standalone.
Yeah.
And the BBC X is a development of an already existing news channel in America. And the whole idea, which I think we should all be proud of in this room, is that it's to test the water whether in America, which is so polarized between, sort of Democrat and Republican news outlets, whether there is space for a more neutral news channel. Now, the research shows that there is an appetite. Whether the reality is that people don't want to be so polarized, we will test over time. And so this really is an operation to test the market and to see. And if there is a market out there, that's fantastic. That, to have BBC values, but with contents that would excite an American public, I think would be a very good thing.
And presumably are the BBC's impartiality guidelines on the current conflict in the Middle East would also apply to the news coverage in America?
Indeed.
That will be very interesting to see how that goes. We've got 10 minutes. We started slightly late, but we've got 10 minutes for questions.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not you, darling. No, not at all. Peter, I'm just not going to come to you first. I'm going to go to the lady at the back with the long, fair hair. Hello.
Hello, thank you. Helen Jay, University of Westminster. Hello, you talk very passionately about safeguards of the BBC's independence and impartiality, but how far can you safeguard while the government still has responsibility for appointing its chair and deciding its funding? And are those something that you would want to see looked at in the future debate?
Well, each government not only operates within its own framework, but it operates within a wider public and is usually sensitive to the needs of a wider public and the context in which it is making an appointment. So I would hope that the context is one where neutrality would be at the heart of what they would do with a new chair.
Lady at the end of the line there and her neighbour next door to her. I'm going to get a lot of women in, because when I came in, all I heard was men. And but that's not to say there aren't good male questions. So we'll have those two ladies.
Thank you very much. Catherine Johnson from the University of Leeds. There's been a lot of talk this morning about the BBC being owned by the public and the importance of public voice. Should the BBC and Ofcom be doing more to actively engage members of the public in discussions about the future of the licence fee and the future of public service broadcasting? And should both of those organisations and our politicians be doing more to explain to the British public what public service broadcasting is, how it works and why it matters?
Yeah, I agree.
How might you do that? Because I don't see it happening.
Okay. Some of it is happening, and I'm not certain that it kind of cuts through enough. Speaking on Ofcom's behalf, I would say that every time we have to make a change, which is a material change, we have to go through a public interest test. And the public interest test is a public consultation. Now, whether the public engages with that or knows it's happening is another story. But in the sense that the opportunity is there, then that's there. In terms of our own reaching out, obviously there are focus groups all the time on the way we're perceived, on trust, and on people's appetite for different programming and so on. How the board engages, I, as the member for Wales as was, we did not go down the route with the new unitary board. We didn't go down the route of the broadcasting councils that were, because we felt in some ways they were kind of self-selecting in a very good way. There were people who were keen, there were people of a certain class, a certain age, and however much you wanted to diversify, it wasn't all that possible. So what we've done is to have facilitated discussions over the past 3 years. They've mainly been on Zoom, but they are actually weighted, according to the public, gender, age, ethnicity, etc., rather than if you hold a town hall meeting and you make a kind of show of being out there to the public, actually who you're creating, you run the risk, let me put it like that, of creating an echo chamber for yourself. And so hearing people who actually sometimes just say to you, I never watch the BBC, I don't think it's for me. That is useful, you know. So that's the way we're doing it at the moment. But I take your point that when we come to setting the debate over setting the licence fee, I think that needs to be a big public consultation. And if you remember back to 2015-16, the number of people who engaged with the public consultation on the Charter were so many. I think it was the biggest response that DCMS had apart from gay marriage.
Yeah, it was.
And they had to bring in extra people to deal with the number of, I think it was 250,000 or something.
And they thought
like
it
that.
was a fix as well.
And so I've no doubt that when the time comes for that big public debate, it should happen, and I know it will happen.
So, lady next to you, then there's two gentlemen here, and there's a gentleman here. So we'll go with that lady in green first.
Thank you. Christine Geraghty. I'm particularly interested in drama and light entertainment. Michael Grade said he felt the big thing with the BBC was it didn't take enough risks. What would you say about that as a board member?
Well, at the same time, I mean, there was a bit of a paradox in what he said, I think. He did mention Fleabag, for example, in the same breath as saying there were no risks. So there are things, I think, not just in drama, but, you know, I was thinking about who would think that a baking competition would become popular? You
Or
know,
a repair shop.
a repair shop. Yeah, or
exactly.
a ballroom dancing. And I come from, you know, theatre, film and television background, so I have a great sympathy with the idea that drama should always, not always, that there should be enough cutting edge. So can I go back to the answer I just gave on values and not volume? I mean, for the board, I think what the board and the chair has to maintain all the time is the tension between good numbers coming in, because that responds to people paying their licence fee. They have a right to have something that pleases them and justify the universality. But at the same time, there has to be enough of an edge there to actually contribute to the UK's creative artistry. And that's the tension always. And it's not easy when... I said in my speech that I think if you are having a leaner BBC, you know, the challenge for us is to maintain it as a better BBC and to find innovative ways forward. Sorry, at the risk of... Can I just give you one example? When Barbara Slater, the head of sport, was challenged, couldn't find, no public corporation could find the sort of money to put on the Premier League, for example, because the amounts were so astronomical, you know, as to be outside our deepest pockets. So at the same time, as she was losing a lot of football, there was an emerging women's football coming through. Now, she took a bet on that. There was an innovative way of saying, I haven't got much money, but I'll use an innovative way of using that money. And look at the growth and the position of women's football now. So that's what I meant by having innovation all the time.
Before I go to... I'm going to eat 5 minutes into our lunch, so don't blame me if your tummies rumble, because we started a bit late. We had a question from David Lloyd, the former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4, who's here watching us on Zoom. His question is, it's been reported that public service programmes, particularly in radio, are being moved to different, more commercially minded departments, with the sinister implication that the BBC has embarked upon full-scale commercialisation. Can Elan please reassure the room that the board is simply conducting a prudent review of the revenue-earning potential of its output, as any board should, with the sword of Damocles of licence fee reduction and abolition still hanging over the corporation? That's a very eloquent question.
That's a very eloquent question, and the answer to it, yes, I can assure him. I just want us to get away for a moment from the idea that there's a sort of purity of purpose and a devilish commercial operation over there. That's somehow the dark arts. I mean, for me, the marriage of the two of them in the service of the parent company, that's the sweet spot for us as a board, and that is what we should be aiming to do.
Gentleman there, just in the front. Did you have your hand up? Next door to the lady in the red anorak? Yes. Microphone, please. They're sprinting down.
They're coming.
Thank you very much.
This is the maiden speech.
Hello, this is Clive Lever representing National Federation of the Blind UK. Some of us have noticed that there are some radio stations who are chasing a younger and ever younger audience, and also that local radio, the more local radio is becoming more regional in the BBC. My question is, how do you think in these days where there is pressure to modernize, digitize, economize, how do we make sure that we ring in the new without ringing out the old too ruthlessly or too soon?
That's a very, very good question. And I can assure you, when I look at here, Broadcast 2040 and so on, you know, the BBC, I talked about the three principles of impartiality and in particular universality. Now, universality means not leaving anyone behind when change happens. So whether it's entering into a more digital model in future, or whether it's changes in local radio, there has to be a balance between reaching out to future generations and not leaving an older one, or and not always an older one, but a less digitized, less digital savvy people behind. And so within the local radio, for example, and I'm going to take that head on because it's been part of the news agenda, the budget for those local radio stations has remained the same, but the balance has shifted from the afternoon programming into more money in that period from 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock into 2 o'clock, and also on local stories online. And there are some pretty positive beginnings, green shoots, that those online stories are cutting through, and that people are suddenly aware that they're getting more local stories, but in a different way, and not so much in the afternoon, but, you know, so it's where you spend the cash. And as you say, if you have less of it, it has to be spent even more wisely.
So my final two questions, a man with a microphone and then a man behind him who doesn't have the microphone yet but will when you hand it to him. Thank you.
Robert Beveridge, VLV member. You've been coping with very tight budgets, and for nearly 20 years in Scotland you've been showing what's sometimes called the Scottish EastEnders, which is called River City, but it's not shown on the UK network. Why not, and why don't you get the best value for money out of that expenditure?
Yeah, that's a fair question. In some ways, I mean, digitisation has actually helped us, because on iPlayer you will get it, and you will enjoy it. I think we are increasingly doing what's called co-commissioning.
Yeah.
And I think we have, in the past, seen the nations as sort of outlying nations rather than part of the fabric of the UK BBC. And so the co-commissioning, which is now underway in response to Across the UK project, is actually about making certain that if we're investing a lot of money, then that money should have as big an impact as possible across the UK. So let's wait. But the simple answer at the moment is that it's also an iPlayer product to which a lot of people are turning. But
thank you. Thank you, Dame Ellen. My name is David Prest. I run an audio production company, an audio-only production company in the UK. 3 weeks ago, I saw an announcement from BBC Studios that it would be competing against people like me in the wider marketplace for audio business. Specifically, 3 specific clients: Amazon Wondery, Audible, and Spotify. 3 clients who I have treasured and nurtured over the last 3 years for their business. It now appears that the BBC Studios is going to be my main competitor, and a main competitor with a huge advantage. A monopoly in terms of talent, in terms of its ability and the development producer teams that can be pulled in to absolutely blast those marketplace and blow people like me out of the water. In TV terms, great. There's an ocean of opportunity. In audio terms, it's a tiny, small, not very deep puddle. You have just put 2 big boots right in the middle of that market for audio companies like me. I'm not alone. There's about 150 of us. We're all very angry. What can you say to us?
Well, I think I would start by saying that you put yourself in an over-vulnerable position, or you portray yourself as very vulnerable. But actually, the BBC does not own all the audio. I mean, you just look at Ken Bruce's departure, or the talents that has gone from radio to commercial companies and have thrived after going. So Chris Evans, for example. So the BBC does not have a monopoly of talent. And I think we are a competitor in the marketplace. We've always been a competitor for the big commercial companies, the radio companies.
Yeah, but those are the radio broadcasters. David's an independent. None of the commercial players actually commission independence. It's only the BBC. I don't think we've got time to explore it, but I do think it might be worth having someone from the BBC having a conversation with the independent companies. Sorry? An international question here. We've run out of time. I'm sorry. And poor Peter York didn't even get a look in. Can we just give her a round of applause? I'd give her the job.